Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Now today I'm speaking with Chris Bryan. Chris, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks very much, Dan. Excited to sit down and chat.
Well, we've been trying to arrange this for a bit of time, and we're finally speaking, and I'm really excited to have you on because you're a man who wears multiple hats, but definitely two hats in terms of being a competitor and being an academic and an applied sports psychologist. So why don't you give us some background, mate, as to what sport you compete in, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, my sporting background is swimming, and then specifically at a high level I moved into open water swimming. So open water swimming became a sport in an Olympic sport in 2008, and it's not for the faint-hearted. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
And for myself, I was looking towards the 2012 and 2016 Olympic Games, with a bit of history on that. And then myself, from an academic point of view, background in sports and exercise science, and I just finished my PhD in psychological resilience across achievement context. So that's in the workplace and in the sports context as well. So that's I would say a bit of my background.
Fantastic. Well, let's, as you mentioned, the swimming. Let's hone in on that. I mean, wow, long distance swimmer. I couldn't think of anything tougher. I really can't. I mean, there probably are tougher things out there, but when it comes to resilience, it's interesting. Now you've done a PhD in resilience. I'm kind of guessing that from day one you had to be pretty resilient to be a marathon swimmer.
Yeah, it's interesting looking back, and I guess where my PhD came from is what I started looking at is actually high achievers. And I want to look at high achievers across sport and the workplace. And I want to try to understand, well, what made high achievers succeed. And for me, it wasn't just success once off or one Olympics or one major business. Specifically, I looked at elite athletes and entrepreneurs. And what you could constantly see is this very predicted straightforward line of success, which was never straightforward. It was always followed by many setbacks, a long process of, you would say, I suppose, failures, and that then allowed these top performers not only to perform, but to perform consistently and to be able to manage these setbacks, and that these previous setbacks allowed them to learn. And then for me, that's what led me to psychological resilience. And of course, you know, as a researcher, you try to say as unbiased as possible, but then my own sporting background, who I would say I was never the most talented, but for sure I was maybe the hardest worker. And again, it's trying to sit back and you're kind of wondering, well, what made you different when, let's say, you're at the national championships at 14 years old and there's hundreds and hundreds of kids. And then when you look at yourself at 22 and you're looking at those other 99 kids who aren't swimming and competing anymore, who were probably somewhat as driven or wanted it as much as you had, and what made you still standing there. It's quite interesting, almost looking back from that point of view.
So you nearly became an Olympian. So when you reflect back on swimming as a teenager, what I hear you say is I wasn't the most talented, but I was the hardest worker. So you must have put in some serious effort to be, as you say, if you take a sample of 100 kids, and you were that one who went on and got close to the Olympic Games, you know, you represented your country. I mean, wow, you must have worked really, really hard. Do you think that work ethic is something that has always been innate in you, or is something that you had to, did you have to work hard to work hard?
Yeah, it's a deep rabbit hole that I could probably talk a long time about.
Go down it, please do.
But looking back and looking through my sporting background, I think I was in a very original place where I was from in Ireland. I was from the West Coast, and the first 50-metre pool in Ireland was 2006 in University of Limerick, and that's when I was 16, and we set up our first high-performance centre. And in that area, the first thing that happened is all the surrounding clubs, maybe there was about 10 different clubs, all the top swimmers decided, okay, well, I want to be part of this performance centre. And you take all of these kids who are number one, who are the stars of their own programs, and all of a sudden we're all put together in a very competitive environment where all of a sudden none of us were the star athlete. We were with a bunch of other stars, and from that journey in 2006 straight to 2016, I was 10 years where there was a constant cycle of these top star athletes joining this performance academy. Again, there's a certain Irish culture, and all our coaches had been international coaches. So out of those 10 years, I had Canadian coaches, multiple British coaches, New Zealand, American, Belgian, I can go on. And it was very interesting now looking back as the fly on the wall, because I was never the star in that program, but I was the only athlete that stood in that program for 10 years, which was quite interesting. And at the very start, out of the 10 top athletes, I was probably number 10. As the years went on, and it almost felt like a very cruel way of X Factor, where every year kids dropped out, and after about 8 years you realise, wow, I'm the only one left standing. And it's almost like a very sad silver lining that everyone else had decided not to persist, that they found points where they thought, look, I'm not good enough, or it isn't really what I want to do. And trying to understand, well, swimming's a crazy sport. We talk about hard work, and I think there are certain sports you look at hard work for, like, again, rowing, gymnastics, swimming, that involve a lot of hours. And for me, in an Irish society of really a Gaelic sport where an early morning at 5 a.m. is absolute madness, where it almost built from a small hunger of, look, I know the guys up in Dublin are doing some morning, so we'll try one morning session. And we try the one morning session. But look, we'll only do one. We won't do any more because it's madness. And you do one morning, and then you look for more opportunity. Say, oh, well, there's another session available, so look, we'll do 2 mornings. And all of a sudden you're doing 6 mornings a week, getting up at 4:30, on deck at 5 a.m., back again in the evening. And it's very interesting how it evolved, because if I had, let's say, a coach who sat down and said, well, if you want to do it, Chris, you've got to do 5-6 mornings a week, we probably would have given up then and there. And it was almost a slow hunger that built. And when I look back at, let's say, well, why did I continue, even after, let's say, 2012 Olympics, where my background was, I'd been ace in World Championships the year before, and I then just had to qualify with a top 15 place 2 months before the Olympics. 3 days out, I realised I kept getting this rash across my chest. Turned out I contracted shingles, but all I had to do was come in the top 15, and at that stage I was probably good enough to be kind of top 5. So I said, all I have to do is qualify, but I had no idea how my body would react. So I go race to race. Final lap, I kind of realised, I've been given a chance here. Turned out I was a photo finish after 2 hours of swimming for the last Olympic spot. They gave it to the other guy, but told me on the day that I would have a place going back. So I kept training, competing, but then I was told a kid from Guam, they were trying to do all-inclusive, the Olympic Games, that they decided to give the place to him. Oh, wow. So 2012 was quite difficult. My other, I would say, who would have been the star in the performance centre, she got glandular fever and competed quite poorly. And then looking back at it, it's, well, why did I persist to 2016 where she did not? And it's trying to look at, I suppose, different ways we were brought up, and I suppose different focuses on coaching. And we could talk about coaching, the environment, and I think that's a big part of why I persisted, in support systems. And even my history of failure, where when I was 12 years old, I was probably barely making finals in the county level. So I was, and these older, bigger, not older, same age, bigger kids were beating me. When I was 14, I was beating all them, but in Irish Championships, I was making finals but not medaling. Age 15, I think I left with 7 silver medals in 7 different events, and 7 different people beat me. And then when it came to 2012 Olympic Games, when I didn't qualify, I think it was that past history of, okay, working hard, but understanding, look, sport's not fair, life's not fair, and on the day you can only do the best with the hand you're dealt, that allowed me then to continue into 2016. But it's just interesting, and then it's even the background now after 10 years of competitive sport, where I'm in the workplace and you're thinking, well, what experience do I have of 10 years of being an athlete, and now how can I compete in the workplace against people who have 8 years experience? And then it goes down to, well, for me the tagline now, and a lot of my research is that elite sport is so much more than create elite athletes. And I think we see that now again and again, and it's not always the case, where you see a lot of elite athletes actually transition very poorly into careers. But then you have a lot of top athletes who have an amazing careers, and it's almost looking at, well, what was the difference? And maybe the difference is even that own efficacy of, actually, what I did, the ability, and when you go into a workplace, you get quite surprised around people around you, and it's a very different work ethic. It's a very different approach, where people are more working for a living rather than working for this huge, mad goal achievement. And I would say the workplace is even more unfair than sport is. But at least it gives you a little bit of a process of understanding this unfairness in sport and life. In sport, it's a little bit more pure, but there's a lot more unfairness. But actually, the skills you build throughout sport, beyond that of just competing to a high level, the ability to be able to work as part of a team, to be able to appraise these setbacks as challenges, to be able to look at these threatening situations and realize they're not the end of the world, to be able to persist and overcome these things. That every single day you get set this hand of cards that isn't going to be very fair, but you need to make the best out of it. I think sport does a lot on that journey to prepare you for the workplace, but I'm not sure athletes necessarily understand how transferable those skills are unless it's actually educated. Yeah.
Well, look, there's loads of rich territory that we can explore there, so that's fantastic. And I actually just want to pull you back to being a kid, because I think this is what's really pertinent here is, you're a sports psychologist and you research resilience, and that bears relation with motivation and self-efficacy and positive psychology, branches of positive psychology. And so when you reflect back as a kid, what I hear you say, Chris, is that you weren't the most talented, but you kept going and people dropped out. What was it? And you talked about early mornings, 4:30 in the morning, and maybe if somebody had said that to you, well, you're going to have to do 6 days a week, you might have dropped out straight away. But over time, you were able to retain motivation or even increase motivation to be able to do those mornings. Did you use mechanisms as a kid? Because I'm guessing you didn't see a sports psychologist. So did you use mechanisms that kept you motivated, that kept you swimming where others dropped away? When you reflect back from what you know about sports psychology now, when you reflect back, did you have mechanisms, or what did you do to keep going?
Yeah, it's. I thought there was something that I had, which I would say was kind of the hunger, and I think started me off quite early on with that hunger of sport that I luckily had quite a lot of role models, and my father was quite big into sport, and I could see how it excited him. So for myself as well, I got quite a lot of excitement towards, I suppose, almost an intrinsic wanting to be as good as you can be. I was lucky enough from even my club level that I had a lot of role models who looked at sport, and they were role models from a champion mindset point of view. They weren't just unbelievably talented. These were guys that appreciated hard work. They appreciated the art of going out there and trying your best. That not being afraid just to work hard. And I think from a young age, that's kind of what focused me on the process rather than just the achievement. Now, don't get me wrong, I was 100% one of those kids who went in, swam a personal best, and was bawling, crying, and all these kids were like, going, why is he never happy? But it's quite interesting, because you'd almost look at these kids and you'd imagine, I'm sure people thought, wow, very pushy parents, where in fact it was quite a very intrinsic, always wanting to do better.
Yeah.
And that then you look at when I came to a later age of maybe 15 or 16, and as you said, these skills, I started becoming someone who would train extremely well, that out of the whole performance team, performance center, any national camps, I would be someone who people would be blown away while I'd be doing training day to day. But when it came to competition, I did not perform. And this was something I really struggled with. And again, it's down to maybe at a young age, I had a club that wasn't really competing at a high level. So I used to train about 4 times a week by myself. When I was 13 years old, I was writing my own sessions. I luckily came at a time where the internet was at my fingertips. And these are the things that I look back at and I say, well, that's very different to the kids and athletes I work on. That my own kind of proactive interest of trying to find different ways to improve, ordering DVDs at the age of 13, trying to improve my techniques because the coaches at the time weren't full-time coaches, and going down to the local pool and writing my own sessions because I knew other people were doing that. Probably from a physiological point of view, probably wasn't getting the same benefit. But it was interesting that I was looking for these kind of opportunities, that they were there, but I proactively looked for them. And then at the age of 16, what I turned out realizing is that I was really struggling. I was hating competing. That I'd get up there, and every time I didn't compete well, the next race had even more pressure because I'd been an extra 6 months without achieving what I should have achieved. And I started getting this real fear of competition. And I actually looked at sports psychology, and it was actually, I think, my mother that started seeing me suffering internally, was trying to figure out, well, how can Chris start enjoying his sport a little bit more? I started downloading sports psychology workbooks, and I taught myself a lot of self-talk, a lot of visualization, and I did a lot of trying to deal with, these negative thoughts about, well, how much did I really believe that, and trying to take the pressure away from the performance and back into the process. That for me, the performance was already done months and months beforehand, and that when I got up to compete, that I was letting my body do what it does best, and that if it went good or bad or otherwise, that was down to the process. So for me, I had to take a lot of pressure around this big performance moment, that now it's time to perform, or actually your body gets programmed to perform, and then on the day you take yourself out of your head into your body and you just try to enjoy why you work so hard for. But it was very, very interesting looking back at, well, I was the one who proactively found, and my support system did that. And then coming to the age of maybe 18, 19, I worked with maybe 5, 6, 7 different top sports psychologists. Again, it was interesting working with them. And even now from an academic point of view, how sports psychology works in practice. And then from the academic side, what did I find valuable? And what for me were the guys that added most value to what I did. Was quite interesting as well. Again, I was a strange athlete, that I was probably a coach's worst nightmare. The fact of, I get told to do something and my first question is going to be why. If I understood what I was doing, I'll do it to the end of the earth. Where I was surrounded by other and probably more talented athletes, and you could tell them to climb up that wall, and they'd climb up the wall, and they'd do no matter what. I'd be like, well, how does that relate to swimming? And if I understand how it relates, I'll do it and do it again. But then for me, I've again looking at little notebooks. Again, I have everything. The biggest thing is now that I'm older, I realize I'm an absolute nerd, and I embrace it. I love it. But I have notebooks and training logs from the age of 12 to 20, and even these self-talks, these sports psychology little notebooks that I wrote for myself, of trying to explain what I was doing, goal setting. It's very interesting to look back on, especially then when you're on a roll now of trying to understand. And again, maybe it biases the way I look at things, but it's quite an interesting perspective, I think, that I've come from.
I think there's lots that you said there. Again, a fantastic, rich landscape of things to talk about, but I'd like to get your opinion on being coachable, because you said something interesting. I was a coach's worst nightmare, and in many respects, I'm listening to you speak, and I'm thinking, wow, you're great for a coach, because you take ownership. You write stuff down. You work hard. You're high conscientious. In many respects, I think you must be great for a coach, but you said you were a nightmare for a coach because you would always question why. And I think it's a really interesting landscape, and it would be interesting to hear what you think, Chris, because I read on Twitter people writing about the importance of, you have to be coachable, got to be coachable, it's a choice to be coachable. But I actually think people who ask why, athletes who ask why, who aren't, obviously coachable, won't just take the first thing that a coach says. I think they often become the champions, essentially. They're students of the game, they're students of their game. They're just not easily convinced by coaches. You as a coach, you have to convince them. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's such a variety of individuals, and we know that. And again, a lot of my research spans across sport and work, and you're looking at, well, what the best coaches do, what do the best managers do, not just from a results point of view, but also from an athlete point of view, and not just from an athlete point of view of when things are good, but also looking back over a lifespan of what made them successful when they look back at their career 10 years on. And a lot of the research in psychological resilience is this qualitative research of interviews of, well, what do you think made you successful? And a lot of that, what made them successful, is almost this trust in the coach, but also the ability to be able to adapt to the individual. And for me, that is what coaching is. You're in the people business. And the thing that I sometimes hate about science is the scientific method looks for statistics based off populations. And when we're dealing with people in the people business, especially in elite sport, and I think the higher you go in elite sport, the more individualized it is. I would like to see a lot more case study approaches rather than, well, what worked for 100 different coaches across 10,000 athletes, where I think things start getting lost in translation. And for me, you find a whole span of athletes and coaches. And when you're moving, and I know as a psychologist, or as you're trying to get into, let's say you're trying to make positive change either in a team, you're trying to make positive change in a workplace, you need to have key stakeholders invested. And so you need to have you need to understand the coach's mindset. You need to have them engage in what they're doing. And I think the question around, well, athletes need to be coachable, and I think that's a very strange thing to say in a way, because generally, I suppose then the difference between looking at sport and the workplace is different age groups a lot of the time. Especially when we talk about youth development, and especially when we talk about Olympic sport, we see a lot of a younger age group who, do they really understand what it is to be coachable? Yourself with massive experience, myself with academic and personal experience, we could have a long and probably debate about what does it mean to be coachable. So to expect an athlete to know and try to be coachable is I think a ridiculous idea. For me, it's the ability as a coach to understand how to get the best out of their athletes. And a lot of the time, it's a very, very frustrating path, and a path of making mistakes that you really understand, well, what works well. In the workplace, it's understanding when things are going wrong. That's really when you understand, you get to know people. Everyone will tell you, I'm invested, I'm here for the company, and I really want to do my best. When things don't go well and numbers aren't great, those conversations are the very, very valuable ones. And because in a workplace, you're not going to find that everyone wants to succeed to the best of their ability. They realize how much effort they want to put in for how engaged they are, down to how much they're going to get out of it, from a financial point of view, from a personal engagement point of view. And it's down to the manager and the organization to realize, well, what's that happy medium? What do I expect of that person, and how can I get the best out of them? Same from a coaching point of view. I think the danger then with coaching is you have a lot of very goal-oriented coaches, which is great, but how much can you really control? And that's going to be a great causer of stress. And you get a lot of these coaches who are trying to create the most controllable environment possible. You talk about these 1%ers. How can we get all these 1%ers? We talk about diet, we talk about routine, talk about sleep. And you could say it's down to the coaches to build that environment. And I hate to, in my opinion, they can only lead the way, they can only educate, they can only create opportunity for athletes to make the right choices. And it often takes the athletes making the wrong choices repeatedly often until they need to decide, look, for me, for what I want to get out of sport, I am prepared to make these choices. So that when you get to the situation of, I would say, spoon-fed athletes or spoon-feeding managers, they're the most stressed, they're the most burnt out, managers and coaches. And again, I like to compare the two. They're not directly comparable, but they're quite comparable. We're dealing with people who are interested in these goal-oriented stakes that are dealing with major stress and also a lot of daily hassles. Sport is a lovely, I would say, laboratory for stress, because you can capture success or loss before and afterwards, where the workplace is harder to define. But for me, it's almost trying to take responsibility off the coaches and the managers to creating success, and rather trying to create an environment that always creates opportunities to succeed. And when we talk about resilience and developing resilience, it really needs to be an athlete-driven process where you want athletes seeking advice of why did that not go so well, rather than an athlete saying, well, why did the coach not talk to me? He thinks he's mad because I didn't do well. That you want athletes to be asking the questions. Well, what can I do better? Well, why do you? And generally, it's going to be like, well, you had exams all week. You dropped out of 3 sessions. You weren't organized, and you want the athletes to almost come up with that rather than the coach controlling that process, because that becomes a very stressful, unsustainable, very, I would say, lacking resilience environment where that kind of success probably isn't very sustainable. Because the minute you remove the coach, and I think in sports you see that situation a lot, especially when we talk about national programs, you get a lot of very good support systems, but is it a really resilient support system and environment? Because straight away you're with a different coach, a lead coach, maybe you're with a different coaching staff, you've gone into the Irish national team, and you're removing the athlete from their very comfortable environments that are probably maybe very spoon-fed. But we don't want to develop those kind of athletes, and we don't want to develop those individuals, because when you bring someone from education to the workplace, it doesn't matter how smart you are. I don't care if you got a 1.1 degree, but it's what happens when you get put in a role you should be qualified for, but it's nothing that you learned in school. And I always remember this cartoon, and they talk about it's like an interview, and the interviewer says, "Wow, I can see you did really well in school, but what real world experience do you have?" And their response is, "Tests. I'm really good at tests." And for me, that is where I think sports comes in, of athletes being able to manage their schooling and their sporting is very, very important. And we can talk about the importance of exercise, the importance of having something other than school, but also I think sport is a vehicle for developing athletes, and I think we don't understand that. We talk about developing elite athletes, and a lot of my research actually looks at, well, what makes people in the workplace more resilient? And what I'm looking at is it's not the ability of competing at a high level, which I was almost surprised at, maybe disappointed personally, but it's the ability to be able to persist past final exams. So the ability of engaging competitive sport over a long time span. Those people who manage to persist through exams, through inevitable failures and disappointments and extra stressors, but actually being able to persist through them, seem to allow those individuals manage work effort during stressful times, is what the research was looking at. And it's just quite interesting about then looking at the value of the process, and then you're looking at key stakeholders such as coaches who probably are very goal-oriented, and are we trying to create elite individuals, and hopefully one of those individuals will decide, I really want to be an Olympic champion, or are we trying to improve our CV and create immediate short-term performances? And that's not just the coach's fault. I would say that's down to cultures, sport cultures, the way the governing bodies focus on it. And we can look at football as a very, very, the Premier League is, well, if you don't perform, how long are you going to have your job for? But then you look at the issues of Manchester United when they get rid of a manager, and well, you're going to have to deal with situations like that. But again, it's just very interesting looking across context, but then looking back over time of what are our roles as coaches, what are our roles as psychologists? Are we trying to get the best performance out of a short time, or are we trying to complement what the key stakeholders such as coaches and support staff are doing to create the right environment, that there's always opportunity, not just for success, but for failure and reflective learning based off that. We could talk about psychological safety as well, which then allows that reflective process. But it's it's a deep, deep rabbit hole that keeps on giving. But I think it's a very important conversation to stand and look back, especially now that I suppose I've seen it from all sides, and I can kind of look back, step back, and kind of say, well, this is what I thought was valuable. This is what I would say was almost unhealthy.
Listening to you speak, going back to the being coachable, what I hear you say is being coachable isn't so much being subservient, it's actually taking the lead as an athlete, as a worker. It's actually having the capacity to take the lead, and the coach providing autonomy and empowering players, people, to take the lead. So there's that, and also what I hear you say, resilience, and I might be coming in from a very basic perspective here because you spent quite a few years studying resilience, but resilience equals persistence, and persistence equals process and environment. And I'm not saying that's, I'm just hearing that through your words. So resilience means persistence, and persistence requires a process orientation, a process focus, and a supportive, impactful stretch environment. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the path I'm looking at. Is again looking at sustainable success. What creates sustainable success? That's persistent and high effort and proactive. You would say discretionary effort, which is effort above the job description. But that discretionary effort is really a proactive effort. And again, we go back to individual athletes. And some athletes will jump; they will love that autonomy, and other athletes will hate it. And it will be like, and you will. Again, it's trying to understand how much you want to challenge the athletes, how much autonomy you want to give, and how much you need to start picking them back up. And it's a very intelligent process from the coach's side of how you can get the best out of these athletes who are not naturally proactive, who are not natural self-starters, but wow, are they talented. But they're the athletes that are going to break your heart. And for those athletes to get the most out of themselves and get the most out of sport, not just these pub conversations in 20 years' time of, when I was 13, what I could have done. Because no offense, but no one cares what you did at 13. No one cares what you did at 14. And I have a lot of conversations with coaches, especially I'm living in Dubai, but out here in Dubai, because it's a very youth-oriented landscape where we don't have a lot of senior athletes. And you've got a lot of these confident coaches that tell me about the amazing things they've done with their 14-year-old. And I think, hey, great job. But then I think, look, I would prefer to look at youth sport as what kind of situation are athletes going to be at 18 if they go to the US into a performance program, to go to the UK, to go to anywhere in Europe, where you're taking them out of this very secure lifestyle. And Dubai is a great lifestyle. And you're going to put them in a program that they've never experienced before. How are you getting them ready for that? That if they want to go to the highest level, they have the capabilities, they have their own self-efficacy, that they understand what makes them good. And it's not just, I had that amazing performance this one time. Or you're not relying on your coach for your source of belief or that understanding. I think it's a real responsibility of coaches to make athletes think and reflect, and to be able to fail. And looking back through past experience in sport, and there's one case of a girl who went to the Olympics and literally, I would say, barely had a whole bump in the road. And the first bump in the road, she was quite young in the Olympics. She didn't make European Championships, and a month later she had retired. And for me, just thinking, just blown away. But I had been through so much rough and tumble and unfairness that I suppose at the age I couldn't understand that point of view. I just couldn't understand it. But now looking back on it, you could just see that when they didn't understand what made them so good, and when they weren't performing well, they just weren't good anymore. Because how good they are, and honestly, this is a lot of the problem with career transition, how good you are as a person depends on how good you are in sport. For me, we'll say I was doing academia the whole time during my athletic career. Even the final 2 years, I'd begun my doctoral research. But the ability to be able to leave the pool, no matter how good or bad the session was, and have something else to bury myself into, to have my own self-worth, that I wasn't always Chris the swimmer, and that I was also Chris the friend, Chris the academic, that I think it's very, very important to have these different pools of esteem and efficacy, that I think then allows me to understand my value in the workplace after that, where maybe a lot of coaches and a lot of different programs have you as the athlete because you want to put all your time and energy into this. I would say from a sports science point of view, it's very logical. It's very, very logical. But the thing about sport is it's not that logical. It is not straightforward. You get to the Olympics, you look at, I would say anyone there, but you look at any Olympic final, every single athlete there is talented. Everybody works hard. And it's really about the mindset, their journey to get there that really separates those guys at the top. And I think that's where we need to almost break the sports science away from the practice. Again, I'm coming from a sports science background as well, and I love numbers. But I see time and time again, numbers do not equal performance. And same for me, I could be training unbelievable, and then I go racing the day, very average. But it also allowed me to realize the whole week up to a competition, not hitting good times. I just knew I just need to start feeling good. This is just part of the process. So when I got up there to race, I was excited to see what was going to happen. I wasn't associating numbers with performance because they do not correlate as much as we think. At the high level, we go to a very science background. We look at 1,000 performers. We look at their run-up and form and diet and sleep, and it will correlate perfectly. You tell me a study that looks at 1,000 Olympic athletes and their sleep pattern. The Olympic athletes won't do it. You can't get samples like that. Again, I love science, just finishing with a PhD, but when we talk about top-level performance, and that's what I like about positive psychology. Again, psychology resilience falls under that positive psychology that focuses, instead of looking at psychology of what is wrong with people, I look at, what is right with people, and how do they do that, and how can we repeat that across organizations, environments, and individuals. And that's something that's not straightforward. You need to take a very in-depth look at what is happening, and that's why resilience is a very, very confusing topic, because it is complicated. It is very confusing. Again, we're trying to move it away from this very base, I would say, unhealthy way of, did you persist or not? And if you didn't persist, you're not resilient. And I think that's very, very dangerous. You look at a lot of health psychology as well, that's turning resilience down to, it's a very reflective approach. That really has a lot to do with the environment. It's not the responsibility of the athlete to be resilient. It's not the responsibility of the coach. It's looking at the environment of trying to find a probable success of resilience, of how can we enable this bounce-back-ability, this ability to persist during stress, and the ability to be able to learn and grow from negative past experience. And it's this process that falls under resilience. And you see the same psychological resources come up again and again for these three processes: persisting, bouncing back, and learning from past experience, that differentiates it from just mere recovery or bouncing back, mere growth of just learning, mere hardiness of just being able to persist. That actually it's a complementary process of reacting to stress positively depending on the type of environment and situation needed. Again, we can go down a big resilience conversation as well, because it's a piece of the puzzle. But again, it's quite a complex process.
How does one develop resilience? How whether it's a swimmer or another sport, what's the basic outline of developing resilience? And within that, I suppose what I hear you say is it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. One can turn up the volume of resilience, and then the volume of resilience can be turned down on particular days or particular events or tournaments. It's an ongoing process, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'd say. How do I develop resilience? Well, it's a temporal process.
Okay.
So how do I develop it? Over time. Okay, what do I need? Resilience in the perfect world is a completely unnecessary concept where everything is great. But luckily for us, we're covered with uncertainty. We have a bunch of unpredictable and predictable adversities. And just over time, we have so much opportunity to develop resilience. And then you can look at it against adversity. You have many different types of adversity. Initially, you might want to look at predictable and unpredictable. There's a game scenario coming up. Maybe it's a series of games.
Yep.
How do we prepare for loss? How do we prepare for team confliction? How do we prepare? There's a bunch of things that are probably going to arise. So it's trying to set up scenarios to deal with those processes. Okay, I know these two players do not get on well. They don't like each other. Well, we don't really need to like each other, but what do we need to have? They need to have trust. They need to have respect. Again, it's resilience. Resilience from a team point of view. It's even having the awareness to see what those upcoming adversities are, and generally from past experience. How do we know this predictable adversity is coming up? Well, it happens every single year. In an organization, there's annual numbers every single time when, if it's good, bad, or indifferent, people probably freak out or they say, okay, we didn't hit our numbers, so let's change everything. Well, maybe we did a year ago, and if you don't persist and look at, well, what went well, what didn't go well. So it's understanding not to be reactive immediately in a situation, to first of all prepare for predictable adversity. And that's the easiest way to build resilience. You can get quite creative then as well of, okay, game scenarios, we miss a penalty kick, basketball free throws, very predictable scenarios. But then we have unpredictable scenarios. We talk about injury in sport. You might talk about organizational change. Talk about these daily hassles, maybe the loss of a loved one. It can be quite significant adversity. So you have these different magnitudes of adversity as well that are unpredictable. And then we look at, in the psychology, well, these are the combination of these personal assets that you would say there are somewhat innate traits of your optimism, your efficacy at any given time. So efficacy is developable, but you would say is trait-like, where efficacy is your own confidence in a given domain. And really what builds self-confidence is evidence. Is, okay, an experience happens, and based off that experience, you need evidence to build confidence, is what I would always say. You can tell someone to be more confident, but actually you need to give them evidence. You need to put them in a situation that will allow them to succeed, and then give them evidence of why that allows them to succeed elsewhere in a game scenario. But you can develop this I would say, resilience capacity to allow you there'll be a certain amount of magnitude that you don't want it to affect your, let's say in a tennis match, or even if you in a golf scenario, you hit a bad shot. It's being able to persist in the moment and building psychological skills to allow you to do that, but also psychological resources to allow you to have the confidence to be able to sustain as the magnitude increases. So there's a certain developable amount of resilience there. But then it's okay, there's the amount of magnitude supersedes the amount of resilience capacity you have, your confidence, where you lose a series of games in a row. But how quickly do you bounce back from that? Maybe you're competing again in a month's time. Are you sitting down with a lower resilience capacity where you've lost that self-belief, that confidence, that optimism? Or are you able to have that support system environment around you? So what do you do when this unpredictable adversity occurs? How do you create this recovery process? How do we deal with failure? What do we do when we lose a match? What do we do when a player is injured? Because these are, again, somewhat predictable. They're going to happen at unpredictable times, but it's down to the coaching staff and the environment to create processes around this bounce-back ability. Because you want the speed of recovery, but then also how much do we learn from those unpredictable scenarios? Because they're going to happen again and again. A lot of athletes are injured again and again, and it's a very, very difficult time. But it's how do you learn from your past injuries? And it's a really horrible conversation because there's not a lot of positives to pull through. But there is a process of acceptance, of denial, of confidence that you've got to this point again, and it's just part of the bigger process, part of the bigger team. How does the team interact with the injured players? How can you do that better? How can you learn from other players being injured? How can the team learn from what they did? How do you create leaders who are injured? Leaders who are injured, and all of a sudden, wow! Look at how Paul dealt with himself through that. Did Paul just stay super confident? No, Paul had a terrible time, but he focused on what he could do. He added to the team what he could, and look, he's back now. It's having leaders of failure, and it's up to an environment and culture, I would say, to be able to create opportunities for resilience development. And again, as I said, there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's trying to understand that, okay, how do we do it? Maybe do we create a lot of simulated adversities? Okay, that you can do that, but I can guarantee there'll be ongoing adversities in each individual lives and performance and It's just looking at the bigger perspective of what way we go about dealing with failure, what way we go about dealing with stress. And it's the one thing that's predictable is unpredictable stress, because it's just a matter of life. And a lot of resilience research before looked at major life adversity, looked at, well, how are people resilient during terrorist incidents? How are they doing during massive natural disasters? A lot of the resilience in academia stemmed from research by Emmy Werner, followed an island off Hawaii, followed a 30-year study, a longitudinal study, looking at high-risk children, and how did those kids develop in later life workplace. So did those kids who were at high risk manage to have a lot of mental health issues, but a lot of the children didn't. They turned out to be highly functioning individuals and achievers, and we talked about them developing this resilience through major life adversity, but a lot of key stakeholders like the social support they discovered as they grew, and they developed this resilience over a lifespan. But this was a significant life adversity. In sport and the workplace, we talk it like a buzzword in the paper every week, resilience. But are we talking about this major life adversity? Probably not. And my first publication was The Relevance of Resilience. So if we're talking about resilience in sport and work, is it even relevant? And then we looked at, well, it is relevant. It's not just relevant in major adversity, but also these daily hassles. And trying to be able to develop resilience for both being able to persist during stress and these performance episodes, and being able to develop resilience after a disruption and be able to bounce back and grow from past experience. And that's what's relevant in sport and work in these achievement contexts. That for us in day-to-day, when we generally aren't dealing with this major life adversity, but we are dealing with adversity. And for us, it is very important, because in our lives, it is important. Where someone on the outside mightn't see it as important, but for us, we can develop mechanisms to deal with that stress better, more efficiently, quickly. But again, it's not absence of stress. It's not absence of negative affect and having this difficult process. It's acceptance of, okay, this is a difficult process, but almost trying to remove the stigma around what resilience is. And that's taking it away from the individual and down to the environment, what cultivates resilience. And I think that's where I think the research is saturated on, is the saturation of these associated support and environment for developing resilience across a lifespan and in these performance episodes. And there's similar resources that come up again and again, this coping skills, these motivation, social support again and again, and that we need to look at it as a process. And yes, you get people who have a higher capacity for resilience than others, but the same, you have much taller swimmers as a majority. Do we cancel out all the shorter guys? No. There's a certain, again, I know Mustafa Sarkar's research talked about this resilient bandwidth, or this developable portion of resilience, and that is, again, the fair and unfairness of life, that, yeah, okay, some people will be more predisposed to be able to handle higher amounts of stress, but then maybe for those people who generally have lower resilience capacities, well, look at all the amount of times they have to bounce back and how important it is for them to bounce back and to learn from experience. So it's, again, coaching and learning to the individual of what is resilience really going to be important for them, because we know after every game they're going to go on this disruption curve. But that's fine. That's just them. And it's up to us as practitioners, researchers, and coaches to understand each individual's, I would say, resilience trajectory over time, and to be able to develop resilience processes for individuals and teams and individuals within teams. And again, there's a whole side of team resilience that, again, I haven't dove into that side of the literature, but it's a massive growing side.
One thing I was going to, as you were talking there, I was thinking about an article I read that you had written, and you talk about the 3 pivotal time points of resilience development, and that's resilient preparation. And you were sort of alluding to this, mentioning this as you were talking there, but that resilient preparation, so before an event or a game, resilient awareness, so during, and then resilient learning afterwards. And I think you spoke a bit about that there. But one phrase I love what you said there was leadership of failure, or dealing with failure through leaders and leadership. And as you were speaking there, it struck me, and it continues to strike me, that as a coach, you've got to be brave, haven't you? Last point of discussion today is you've got to be brave as a coach to bring this resilience piece into your coaching culture, your coaching practices, your coaching environment, because they are hard conversations. You said about hard conversation related to injury, and I think there you mentioned about, hey, well, we can throw it into our activities, we can make tougher our activities tougher and all that, but I think you've got to be brave as a coach to have these continued conversation, so that over time you're helping your players, your people, your athletes, your competitors become more adaptable, more resilient. Would you say brave is the right word? Is it about bravery as a coach, Chris?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I suppose it's hard to know which word it is, but I suppose it then even goes to about confidence about the way you do things around here, right? It's about committing to the process, and I think again it goes back to trying to create positive change within teams and organizations, and you need that buy-in. Yep. And to have that buy-in, you need trust, and yes, as you said, those key stakeholders to be brave. I know there's an example that I've heard about before about Dennis Bergkamp and the way he manages teams, and he talks about that he tries to allow, he wants players to be trying new things. And if they're not trying new things, then they're going to be afraid to fail. That only by trying these new things do they make mistakes. And then by making mistakes, they learn, and then they create these wow moments. That he tries to create this psychological safety to allow players to use both feet. That, okay, it might cause the team to underperform at a youth level. But actually, later on in the game, it allows them to be able to create these unexpected moments. But for the coach, I would say at a youth level, to allow a right-footed player to use his left foot more, he's accepting that the level of performance is probably going to be suboptimal, because the benefit and developmental qualities it'll allow is more important in the long term. And I think when we talk about youth sport, it's about being brave, that it's trying to allow players to fail and try new things. That it's again going from what I talked about earlier, this controlling performance, the very dangerous, and I think the mental health side of this spoon-fed controlling coaching approach of, okay, we want to get these 1%ers, but we're not allowing athletes to be okay with risking these 1%ers for these wow moments. And you control the controllables, and I understand that. That's where the 1%ers come. But control the controllables, and there's only so much you can control. So you've got to be able to adapt, and allowing players to have that psychological safety to try new things, because they'll have to adapt. They need to learn to adapt. I think that's the braveness of the coach and the support team, to allow players to do that, again, at the right time. I think timing is everything. Do you go to the most important race in someone's life and tell them to, look, try that new thing we were talking about? Absolutely not. But it's about the process of how they got to that point of trying those new things. That when things go wrong, they're used to things going wrong, and they can adapt. And I think that comes down from, as you said, the braveness, but the buy-in, the trust of the environment, culture, opportunity of what we're trying to do, and the bigger picture idea. And I think organizations don't let managers do that. Sports organizations don't let clubs and performance centers and teams do that, because they really want the performance. But actually the culture you build around the sustainable success, and you see a lot of the golden years. Well, in countries that do this really well, it's a culture of success that's down to the process. And you look at a lot of countries where, I suppose, like China is a very straight up one, where they have 1.4 billion people. And I think World Championships are going on at the moment. And I know I'm going right to sport specific, and they're 4x200 freestyle relay. They have 3 unbelievable guys. But their 4th guy is not that good. And you kind of try to think, out of a country of 1.4 billion people, how do you not have 4 good guys on the relay team? And I think that goes down to they really try to control every single athlete. And we don't want to go into the whole drug side, but again, even that mentality is a very, very controlling mentality of, well, we need to make sure we get the best success possible. It's a very, I think, very fear-mongering approach where you're not trusting the process of the athletes to do their job. And you look at smaller countries, again, they're big populations like Australia and Britain, but nothing compared to 1.4 billion people who consistently hone the talent they have into sustainable success. And then they become leaders in their sport because they become performers for 10, 15 years that build a culture of how we want to do things. Where you see these athletes, and okay, I'll bring Russia in as well. But Russia and China, they do unbelievable and you never see them again. And you don't have these leaders in sport. And of course you will always get a lot of gold medals because it's just the cream rises to the top in these certain populations. But again, this is just a very specific example where I look at a 4x200 relay team in the men's and just think, how do they not have 4 good guys? I know it's 3, but it's again, I know there's a lot more to that conversation. It's a big, again, there's too many pitfalls and rabbit holes to get into. But for me, it's then looking at even down to each organization. Again, I'm working out here in Dubai, and I know I went to a talk recently and looking at sport and development across UAE, and they talked about what the Australian system do in talent identification. And again, I'm thinking, the population here of local Emiratis and talent identification, it's just not the same. Because you're dealing with different populations. Same in Ireland and the UK. A lot of problem with Irish sport is we try to look at the UK system and replicate. We've, surprisingly, very different cultures, but very different populations in sport as well. And that for us, you need to really focus on the individual. And coaching to the individual and developing resilience individuals and environments is that bit more important because we don't have that same amount of talent. One of my coaches who I would say wasn't the most personable guy, he was a very logical guy. We used to go to Australia every year and train. And there was the Olympic champion at the time. I was training with him. He was kicking my butt a little bit, which is to be expected. And this is a 6'7" guy. And I'm sitting at, 5'10" and a half. I'm proud about that hat. And I looked at him and I said, well, what have I got to do to beat this guy? And he looked at me and he said, you can't. Which wasn't a very nice thing to say.
No.
But when we get talking about it a little bit more, he said his focus, and it was very, very interesting, was like, okay, in Ireland there's one Chris Bryan. But in China, there's 1,000 Chris Bryans who are just as talented. But you're only going to race the 2 Chris Bryans who beat all the other Chris Bryans, who do absolutely everything right. But in Ireland, I'm probably going to race them anyway. But if I want to beat those guys, I've got to do absolutely everything right. But also, I'm luckily able to, I'm probably going to compete for those 10 years at the top level. They're probably going to have their 2 Chris Bryans changing every 4 years.
Yep.
The ability to build that experience at the high end, again, is probably what separates those top 8 guys. So we have opportunity to build the sustainable performance. But also, we have this almost big fish, small pond mentality. And again, it goes down to coaching to the individual, to trying to build environments down to the cultures and population we have. And it goes down to, okay, do the athletes need to be coachable? No, we need to be very aware of the athletes and cultures and environments we're in and we need to compete in. And it's up to these key stakeholders to trust the process of what we've decided to do, what we agree the athletes we need to create, not just for now, but also for future, also for healthy performing individuals in the future, in the workplace. And it's a very specific conversation, in my opinion. But yeah, it's a deep rabbit hole.
It's a rabbit hole we need to explore more of. And look, I love some of the things, some of the little gems that you've uncovered. Wow moments, leaders of failure, which sounds negative, but my picture of that is it isn't. It's positive. It's having brave conversations.
It's inevitable.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely, it's inevitable, and you have to have conversations about that. And I know a lot of people will want to know more about. So Chris, how can people get in contact? What social media are you using, and what are your handles?
Yeah, for me it's Twitter. I guess I mostly look from an academic point of view, and you can get in touch and follow up through email if you need me. And my handle is Chris Egg Snob. So that's ChrisAgsnamh, and that is the Irish translation of Chris Swimming. But you might know Sonia O'Sullivan.
Yes.
He was an amazing Irish runner, and I was lucky enough to meet Sonia a few times. And Sonia is Sonia Aigre, and she gave me face-to-face permission that it would be a good idea to go with Chris Ixnov. She was my leader at that point from the social media point of view. So you can catch me, Chris Ixnov, no fodder. We've gone without, but get in touch. And again, I've a vast amount of experience in many different areas. But for me now, it's looking at work in sport, and specifically now actually looking at organizations and developing resilience in organizations. And for me, that's something that I'm very interested in, taking what I know from sport, applying to the workplace, but also trying to educate athletes the value of sport beyond that of creating elite athletes, and then trying to help organizations see that value. And I think that's something I'm quite passionate about, and that's my research almost moving forward past my PhD.
Well, you sound it, Chris, and we'll have to get you back on talking about that, because I know it's something that interests me, taking it from the pitch, the court, and the course into the corporate boardroom. But look, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the Sports Site Show today, mate.
No, absolute pleasure. Thanks very much, Dan.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch, whether it's via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think about the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.